Part 15 commences with chapter 17. Bani Israel, the Israelites, are Isra, the night journey. Revealed at Mecca, 12 sections, 111 verses. This chapter goes under the name of the Israelites, who after being made a great nation and having risen to power and eminence in the world, were severely punished on account of their transgressions. It opens and ends with a reference to the history of that nation. The opening reference is to the Mi'raj, the ascension of the Holy Prophet, which must be interpreted as referring to the eminence which he was to achieve, and the greatness which Islam was to rise. The Muslimin are warned of the fate of the Israelite nation, which after rising to eminence was punished twice on account of its misdeeds. The reference, no doubt, being to a similar fate which was to befall the Muslimin. The second section establishes the immortal principle that every deed has a consequence, the universal law of cause and effect, a right understanding of which alone can raise man to the true dignity which befits humanity. The next two sections contain moral precepts which the Muslimin are required to follow, yet all these high moral teachings only cause the disbelievers to grow harder, as is shown in the 5th section. The 6th deals with the punishment of the earlier as well as the latter opponents of truth, disclosing the marvelous prophecy that a time would come when the whole world would find itself in the jaws of destruction. The 7th section refers to the universal law that the mischief makers have already stood up in opposition to the righteous, and the 8th speaks specifically of the opposition to the Holy Prophet. The next section, however, makes it clear that opposition would be brought to naught, for falsehood must disappear before the advance of truth. The advance of the Holy Prophet has been here described as the advent of the truth, the spirit of truth mentioned by St. John. Looking aside the fact that the Gospel of John was a rewrite from something about Bacchus from 4 centuries earlier, but and then it was put through further editions to make it bigger and some other stuff. But the 10th shows how great a miracle is the Holy Qur'an in itself, yet the opponents seek other signs. How trivial are the excuses on which they reject the Holy Qur'an is set forth in the 11th section, and the justice of their retribution is made clear. The last section draws attention to Moses' warning to Pharaoh, the mighty ruler of Egypt, and gives a similar warning through the Holy Qur'an, ending with a brief mention of the absurdity of the doctrine of sonship, which is dealt with at length in the 2 chapters that follow. As regards the date of revelation of this chapter, there are many indications that it belongs to the early Meccan period and must have been revealed in or about the 5th year of the call. The mention of Isra, which is the same as Mi'raj in the 1st verse, shows it to be an early revelation because Mi'raj is also mentioned in another chapter, the star, which is also one of the early revelations. Well, don't they say, well, before the ascension, most of the narrations are after that. So most of the prophetic career, I think, is past that. But we could also look at that and say, and when I say career, I don't mean that he made money from his religious role. Ibn Mas'ud, who was one of the early converts to Islam, is reported to have said, speaking of the 5 chapters, the 17th to the 21st, they are the early revelations, and they are the ones I committed to memory first. Bukhari, chapter 66, number 6. And this chapter, at 64, the different ways in which Satan tempts, but you got a prostration pointed there, and we're also to think, so there's wasting one's time, but among there is something that's even worse, and that there's something worse to begin with that doesn't, hence the charging of the armies of Satan, not just the voice. Chapter 18, Al-Kahf, the cave, revealed at Mecca, 12 sections, 110 verses. This chapter deals entirely with the Christian religion and the Christian nations, and that is the reason for giving it the name the cave. The distinctive characteristic of Christianity is its institution of monkery, which required for its practice such corners of solitude as caves. Well, you can also say this could address the Buddhist and, Hindus and something too, but the story of the dwellers of the cave is in fact the story of the Christian religion, whose first condition was one of dwelling in caves in perfect seclusion, but whose last condition is that of material engagements in trade and industry, hinted at in the word Raqim, our inscription, in verse 9. The last chapter is brought to a close by pointing out the error of attributing a son to the divine being, while the very doctrine is denounced at the commencement of this chapter, thereby clearly establishing the connection of the two. The chapter opens with a plain denunciation of the Christian doctrine of sonship of Jesus, and then refers to the earthly embellishments which hinder the Christian nations from accepting the truth, yet we are told that it was their ancestors who cut off all worldly connections for the sake of their religion. The second and the third sections deal with a certain story of Christian youths who sought refuge in a cave, but the story has evidently beneath it a deeper significance and contains prophetical reference to the latter history of Christianity itself. The fourth section shows that true guidance, now offered in the Holy Qur'an. The fifth illustrates in a parable that the Christians will reject the truth at first because of their great power and wealth. The next two sections deal with the bringing of the guilty to judgment and their ultimate helplessness, while the eighth indicates how warning is disregarded when the first is given. The ninth and 10th sections take us back to the story of Moses, whose travels in search of knowledge make him discover a man of God, superior in knowledge to himself. If the story be taken as speaking of the Mi'raj, or ascension of Moses, it may be interpreted as affording a contrast between the narrow limits of the Mosaic dispensation and the universal nature and high ideals of the Islamic dispensation, later times, because before Muhammad, there were national or even more local prophets, and the message obviously was known to have been lost, but it gave people an opportunity for a time. And I guess in fragments it gives people still opportunity, but not enough for some people. So the 11th section speaks of Darius the First, the two-horned one of Daniel's vision. Well, there's Qurash. Qurash is really known as the two-horned one, but and of his great efforts against the two tribes known as Gog and Magog, the real object being a prophetical allusion to their latter-day representatives. Qurash is Cyrus the Great, by the way. To the latter-day representatives, the people, the steppes of Asia, the Hyperborean people, the Mongolians and the Russians, or you could say that extends down into China and the Turks, but the real object being a prophetical allusion to their latter-day representatives. The last section of the chapter again refers not only to the basic doctrine of the Christian religion, but also to the great ingenuity in manufactures of the nations professing that religion, whose labor is lost in the world's life, and thus draws the very picture of the present condition of the Christian nation. The whole of this chapter is revealed at Mecca and is shown in the introductory note in chapter 17 as an early Meccan revelation. Now, the fish, the fish and the two, well, doesn't that remind you of the Pisces fish, how the one rised, and then you have the second book of Maccabees, which mentions Judaism, and then you have the other rise, and you have Paul's ministry? That's just what I think of. But chapter 19, Maryam, Mary, revealed at Mecca, 6 sections, 98 verses. The controversy with Christianity is continued in this chapter, and the title is taken from the name of Jesus' mother Mary. The circumstances connected with her having given birth to Jesus are narrated here, but while the last chapter deals at great length with the history of Christianity, then, with its doctrines, this aims at proving the falsity of the Christian religious dogmas, which it shows to be absolute innovations and quite foreign to the teachings of all the prophets. The first 2 sections deal with the last representatives of prophecy and house of Israel, viz. John and Jesus. The false doctrines that grew up around the name of the latter are clearly denounced. At the end of the 2nd section, the history of Abraham in the 3rd and that of some other prophets in the 4th are referred to as showing that God always sent men as his prophets to reform the world. Toward the close of the 4th section, it is stated that mere faith unattended with good deeds is nothing, and that faith cannot benefit a people except when it is translated into practice. The 5th section deals with the opponents of the prophets generally, while the 6th brings to a close the discussion of Christian religion by outspokenly denouncing the false doctrine of the sonship of Jesus. It is quite certain that the most important portion of this chapter, these relating to the history of Mary and Jesus, was revealed early at Mecca, the most probable about the 5th year of the Holy Prophet's mission, because this portion was was recited by Ja'far, head of the first batch of the Muslim immigrants in Ethiopia, before the Christian king of that country, when a disputation of the Quraysh urged the king to expel the Muslim refugees from his country. A.H., Volume 1, page 203. The emigration took place in the 5th year, and this chapter, therefore, must have been revealed before that. And different people, either because they were learned or they were deputized with the chapter, made the Quran known to certain groups of people as a result. Of course, it was Muhammad who received the revelation, so it's through him first. So that's the first that we should look at in understanding the chapter. I mean, as far as the life in this age. But this chapter, lesser extent with the next chapter, but this chapter 19 is sort of the supremeness of what you could call dubstep, but you follow this and then there's this break in the beat, but it's part of the thing. But you're prepared for it, which is sort of a dubstep is sort of working on the whole grunge up and down sort of thing. But well, I mean, that was done before grunge. But what I'm saying, the Quran does some of the stuff that music does. Now, if you don't like dubstep, that doesn't mean you're not going to like the sound effect. Chapter 20, Qaha. Revealed at Mecca, 8 sections, 135 verses. The initial letters of this chapter serve as its titles. The greater part of it is devoted to the story of Moses, showing how Moses was successful after passing through various trials. The subject matter of this chapter is given in the very first statement made in verse 2, that Al-Quran was revealed to be triumphant in the world. The last chapter deals at length with the story of Jesus and is followed by one dealing in detail with the story of Moses. It opens with a comforting message to the Holy Prophet to the effect that he should not be disheartened by the bitter opposition to his preaching, because his mission would assuredly be crowned with success. The first 5 sections, out of a total of 8, are taken up with the story of Moses, the prophet's mission, being introduced towards the close of the 5th section. The remaining 3 sections are taken up with the destruction of the opposition to the prophet and the consequences of that opposition. The revelation of this chapter belongs to the same period as that of the last chapter. Both Ibn Hisham and Ibn Sa'ad connect this chapter with the story of Umar's conversion to Islam, which took place in the 5th year of the Prophet's call. It was the recital of this chapter by his sister that changed Umar's murderous intention against the Prophet into a feeling of deep love and reverence for him. And they say, "Oh man," but the abbreviated letters, we can leave them as a mystery in that respect, rather than trying to connect them with other usages, which every single one you actually have traditions of various usages that aren't directly attributed to Prophet Muhammad. So therefore, it's not Muhammad's comment of what they mean. So part 17 commences with chapter 21, Al-Anbiya, the Prophets, revealed at Mecca, 7 sections, 112 verses. This chapter deals more with the deliverance of the righteous than the punishment of the wicked, more with the triumph of truth than the annihilation of falsehood, though the one no doubt implies the other, while it is devoted in part to general statements regarding the deliverance of the prophets and the ultimate triumph of their cause, and hence goes under the name the prophets. The history of Abraham is particularly referred to, as is that of Moses in the last. The chapter begins with the certainty of the punishment of the opponents, and is followed by a clear declaration that the judgment approaches and reckoning is nigh. We are then told that the truth must triumph now as it has always done, and this is shown in the second section. The third draws attention to the truth of revelation in general, and the revelation of the prophet in particular. The fourth calls attention to the predominance of mercy and the divine nature, for mercy dealing was specially to mark the punishment of the Holy Prophet's opponents, and in this respect Abraham was to be his prototype, whose history forms the subject matter of the next section. The sixth shows how the prophets have always been delivered from the hands of their enemies in the most critical circumstances, and the last adds, the righteous will be made to inherit the land, and truth will ultimately prevail. As regards to the date of its revelation, see the introduction note on chapter 17. And is this the chapter that has the most mention of the prophets? I mean, it, has the most mentioned. Certainly, I guess you could say the most mentioned compared to size. Chapter 22, Al-Hajj, the pilgrimage, revealed at Mecca. 10 sections, 78 verses. It's interesting to note that there's 78 cards in the tarot, and another 78, the shayateen thing. There's that 77 verses. While the last chapter deals generally with the ultimate triumph of truth in this world, this deals particularly with the triumph of the truth at Mecca, whence the prophet was now being expelled. The chapter is called the pilgrimage, because the proclamation of pilgrimage, originally made by Abraham, was now repeated by the Holy Prophet and addressed to the whole world, being no longer confined to the borders of Arabia. The chapter opens with the mention of a terrible calamity which is, as it were, a preliminary to the triumph of truth in the world. The second section asserts the certainty of divine help to the Holy Prophet. The next section asserts the triumph of the believers, who are now fleeing by twos and threes to escape persecution by their cruel oppressors. Their triumph, however, involved the conquest of Mecca, for without that spiritual center in their possession, the triumph could not be complete. The fourth section speaks of the sacred house and the pilgrimage to it. The connected subject of sacrifices is dealt with in the fifth, and the sacrifices which the Muslims themselves are now required to make, viz., the laying down of their lives in the cause of truth, and are spoken of in the sixth section, which introduces the subject of fighting. The opposition to the Holy Prophet is mentioned in the seventh, and the eighth states that the faithful will be established in the land. Allah's dealing, however, with even the opponents of the truth is merciful, and therefore the punishment is withheld for a while. Thus we are told in the ninth section, which also shows that mere difference of belief are not punished in this world. The 10th sums up the whole by showing that polytheism will ultimately be uprooted. Rodwell is certainly wrong in placing this chapter among the latest Medina revelations. Muir places it at the close of the Meccan Suwar of the 5th period, and external as well as internal evidence tends to show the correctness of this view regarding verses 39 to 41. However, it may be added that, though they speak of permission to fight, it does not follow that they were revealed in Medina. For a full discussion of the point, note 1697, 1668 starts the notes for this chapter. It is noteworthy that the oath of allegiance taken by the Medina converts at Aqaba before the Holy Prophet's flight contained a promise that they would fight in defense of the Holy Prophet. Such an oath would not have been taken if a revelation permitting fighting in self-defense had not been received by the Prophet. And so, to some, this chapter kind of has more of a Book of Revelations sort of feel to it, although I want to be careful with that phrase that applies some things to some people. But the purpose, the end times chapter, yeah, that does some stuff. But chapter 18 is the one that's a protection for the end times. Well, I mean, it evokes out of yourself and forms this invoking connection with God that brings in protection in matters, particularly when you talk about the first 10 and the last 10 verses. And the allegorical and literal way of taking that text is chapter 22 is less symbolic in that way, but it's practical. What's the purpose of war and all that sort of stuff. But part 18 commences with chapter 23, Al-Mu'minun, the believers, revealed at Mecca, 6 sections, 118 verses. This chapter, which brings the third group of Meccan chapters to a close, is known under the name of the believers because it deals with the success of the believers. It is rightly regarded as one of the latest Meccan revelations, and this is amply attested by internal evidence, the final word of any kind of device, and as a firm expression of the success of the believers. The chapter no doubt forms an appropriate sequel to a group of chapters dealing with the great and triumphant force of Islam. It seems to continue, in fact, the subject matter of the last chapter, and therefore asserts the success of believers in clear and forcible words in the first section, which is followed by 2 others referring to similar success in the case of former prophets. The 4th section tells us that the history of the prophet is, in fact, a repetition of the history of previous prophets. The last great divine revelation was a final blow at polytheism, which really stands condemned out of the mouths of its own votaries. As the 5th section shows, the 6th brings the subject to a close by showing how the wicked will finally regret their evil deeds. And one of the things, aside from the arguments against the argument against reincarnation, or arguments, it depends on how you phrase that, and the general protection against evil and how to deal with evil, or the influencers thereof. Islam's not one of those faiths that's all where a person can say, I'm a believer, and not be acting it out. You got to be acting out the faith to a certain degree to be a believer. You can be legally in the fold of Islam, and again, you can't be legally in the fold of Islam if you've given up your contact prayers, if you've given up the alms. Now, some people neglect, and that doesn't take them legally out of the fold, but chapter 24, Al-Nur, the light. Well, An-Nur is how would you pronounce it typically. Revealed at Medina, 9 sections, 64 verses. The title of this chapter, The Light, is taken from the statement made in section 5, where Islam is shown to be the most perfect manifestation of divine light, which will illuminate the East as well as the West. As already pointed out in the last introductory note, the group of Meccan chapters, beginning with the 17th and ending with the 23rd chapter, deals with the great and triumphant future of Islam, and hence it is fittingly followed by a Medinan chapter, which promises in the clearest words the establishment of the kingdom of Islam, verse 55. While showing Islam to be a perfect manifestation of divine light, it is added that this light will first illumine the houses in which the Muslimin live, verse 36. The home being thus the unit for spreading light throughout the world, this chapter deals specially with the purity of home life and therefore opens with the condemnation of adultery, the canker of the purity of home life. There is another reason too. The chapter promises the establishment of a Muslim kingdom, and kingdom brings ease and luxury in its train, leading to such social evils as adultery and slander. While the first section deals with adultery in general, the second speaks of a particular case of slander, the slander being made against Aisha, the Prophet's wife. The third section, while pardoning Aisha's slanders, deals with the slanders of women in general. The fourth section deals with the preventative measures which serve as a check upon adulterous intercourse. Then follow 3 sections dealing with the kindling of divine light in the Muslim hearts and the manifestation of divine power and reestablishing the kingdom of Islam. The 8th section again refers to the subject matter of the opening sections by enjoining respect for each other's privacy, which is calculated to put restraint upon the tongue of slander. And the last section teaches respect for the Prophet's orders because of his orders related to the welfare of the community. The whole of this chapter is universally held to be a Medina revelation and is almost certain that the major portion was revealed about the 5th year of the Hijrah. And one of the things we find, as much as we can say genders, language or something like that, we're warned about making accusations. If you don't know, don't say something. If you're going to say something, talk as if somebody did something bad, even if it's a probable. Hey, if you're not a witness, you're not a witness. Keep your mouth shut. And also, people that are put through hardship. Now, people are, who want to get into bad business, but people who are forced into bad business. Actually forced, not, well, I don't know of another way, and I'm going to do it this way. But it's consensual, sort of thing. But if it's not consensual and you're like forced into crime by a gang or something like that, punked out or what, or however you're going to phrase it, you're forgiven, and maybe you have merit because the hardship you go through is greater than the full-on punishment for everything that you've ever did. But there's no blame on people and how they're victimized, is my point. Chapter 25, Al-Furqan, the discrimination. Revealed at Mecca, 6 sections, 77 verses. This chapter, which is entitled The Discrimination, and it bears the same opening, Tabarak al-Ladhi, as the chapter 67, but it's entirely a Meccan revelation. It belongs, in all likelihood, to the last Meccan period, as it shows that the signs of the great transformation, which was to be brought about by the Qur'an, could now be seen in the lives of the companions of the Prophet. The last chapter, Medina Revelation, speaks of the divine light, which was manifested through the Prophet, and is therefore followed by a chapter which shows that the light was now being manifested in the lives of the Prophet's companions. The chapter opens with the statement of the Holy Prophets that the Holy Prophet's message was for all nations and of the world, and as the last exposition of the doctrine of divine unity, it must unite all the nations and uproot all sorts of polytheism. The disbelievers objected to the Prophet being immortal, and to this an answer is given in the concluding words of the 2nd section, which asserts the truth of the warning. The 3rd section points out that a discrimination will be finally made between good and evil, and refers to the day of discrimination or the battle of Badr. These general statements are followed by concrete instances of the fate of the previous peoples, some of which are very briefly referred to in the 4th section. The 5th section draws attention to some natural phenomena which beat evidence to the law of gradual growth in nature, showing that truth was gradually gaining ground. This chapter is brought to a close by a description of the righteous servants of the beneficent God, being, in fact, an indication of the mighty transformation which had already begun to work. And chapter 26. The Poets. Al-Shu'ara. Revealed at Mecca, 11 sections, 227 verses. The title of this chapter, The Poets, is taken from a reference to the Poets in verse 224, where arguments are given that the Holy Qur'an is not the work of a poet. It's interesting that it has the second most number of verses. The fact the whole chapter deals with this oft-repeating allegation of the opponents by showing them that the Holy Prophets' work and preaching were similar in detail to the work and preaching of the preceding prophets, bearing no resemblance whatever to the work of poets. And, that they did stuff for style. While the prophets spoken of here are identical with those in the 7th chapter, while they are mentioned chronologically, their order in this chapter is different. Moses coming first, the object being to draw attention to a repetition of the history of Moses in the history of the prophet. In the opening section of the chapter, the Holy Prophet is given consolation and told not to grieve too much on account of the disbelief of the people, nor yet to despair of their reformation. The history of Moses is taken up in the next 3 sections from the time of his message to Pharaoh to that of the Pharaoh's drowning, together with his host in the Red Sea. Well, the Reed Sea, actually. The Quran doesn't make it the Red Sea, but the 5th section takes us back to Abraham, because that patriarch gives us the connecting link between the houses of Israel and Ishmael are between the 2 great prophets, Moses and Muhammad. The next 5 sections are devoted to the narratives of Noah, Hud, Saleh, Lot, and Shuaib. In chronological order, the fate of the opponents of each of these prophets is being, as it were, a warning to the opponents of the Holy Prophet, and this is clearly indicated in the concluding section of this chapter. The 3 chapters, 26, 27, and 28, form a group, not only connected in subject, but also belonging to the same period, and may be called the Ta-Sin meme group. But, the Ta-Sin meme, occurs once. Between 2 Ta-Sin memes. All 3 belong to the Middle Meccan period. The chief point in each is the story of Moses, with which they all begin. Although the 28th chapter makes only a brief reference to it, in each case, the story begins with Moses being called to prophethood at Mount Sinai with a special message for Pharaoh, ending with the Pharaoh being drowned in the Reed Sea. The Quran doesn't make the Red Sea thing possible. The latter wanderings of the Israelites are not referred to in any of them. The common thread of the narrative in all 3 chapters gives us the clue with the subject matters to their connection with what has gone before. The 25th chapter speaks of the Furqan, or the great distinctive sign that was given to the Holy Prophet, and that these 3 chapters really supply. The Furqan, or distinctive sign given to Moses, which is shown in verse 85, was the drowning of the Egyptians in the Reed Sea. Hence, the narrative is in all cases brought to an end with that incident. And, the Red Sea was the, that comes from the Greek version, but the Quran does not support, shows details to show that interpretation is not right.